Okay, let's talk about cinematics. So, when I say cinematics, I'm talking about that buttery, smooth, creamy footage that you see in movies. The thing about cinematics is it isn't that complicated. The hardest thing about cinematics is your creativity.
What do you mean by creativity?
Well, I'm glad you asked, alternate version of me from the multiverse. When I say creativity, I mean that every camera, well, almost every camera, has a manual mode. Okay, so when it comes down to manual mode, you got really four settings. I'll say four. It's really three, but I'll say four, and I'll talk about the fourth one really, briefly. But the three that I'm talking about for manual mode is ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. When you learn those things, buttery footage, buttery footage. You can get what you want with those things. And I know that it seems like it's this whole big complicated thing, but it's very simple. And I would go as far as to say that out of all of those are equally important, not just one. But the hardest part, like I said, is your creativity and how you decide to use each and every one of those settings that are on your camera. Get to learn those. Man, the camera world is your oyster or your clam. The fourth one I want to discuss was white balance. White balance is important because it helps you to control the color temperature in this thing that we call kelvins. And the cameras are kind of weird with that, but we'll talk about ISO first. Okay, so what on God's green earth is ISO? ISO is how much light your camera is allowing in. So there's a setting, it literally says ISO when you put it in manual mode. And there's a setting that the higher it goes up, I mean, we're talking like 8,000, all of that jazz, it'll add brightness to your footage or your picture, and it'll also add grain. On the opposite end of that, when we're talking about ISOs like 200 and 100, depending on the environment, it could be a darker footage. I mean, you won't have grain, but you won't be able to see what's going on. Actually, you may have grain, especially if you're shooting in log, and if that's not your native ISO. But that's another story. But make sure that when it comes down to ISO, you aren't cranking it up too high to where your footage is grainy and too low to where it's underexposed. So you got to find that middle ground, that sweetness. You know what I'm saying? And that's very important for cinematics because unless it's the stylistic thing that you're going for, like I said, the only limit is creativity. So it's really up to you. It's really up to you. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is shutter speed. What is shutter speed? Shutter speed is how long the shutter of your camera is open. Simple, right? Shutter speed. The quickness of how long the shutter is open. Simple. So a fast shutter is shutters that you would use to like film sports and fast moving objects like NASCAR and all of that jazz. A slower shutter would be like what you would use to try to get those streaks of light and if you're doing long exposure, stuff like that. So that helps with the cinematics as well, depending on what shutter speed you want to go for, depending on what you're filming, depending on what you're shooting. But shutter speed is how long the shutter is open for your camera. So that's really up to you. I would advise that you do the rule of double. If you're filming, if your shutter speed is, well, if your frame rate is 24 or 60, so let's say 24, then your shutter speed should be 1 over 50, not 1 over 48, because cameras don't have 48, but 1 over 50. If you're shooting in 60, your camera should be 1 over 120. So the rule of double, that's to make sure that everything is seamless and everything matches. So that's shutter speed for you. Okay, now let's talk about everybody's favorite, aperture. Aperture is everybody's favorite because it is what gives you that creamy, blurry background that you see in these cinematic videos and these nice photos. It's the aperture or f-stop. It's determined by the lens. Sometimes lenses will give you, f2.8. Sometimes lenses will give you f2.4. Depending on what you're looking for, you pick and you choose. But aperture is basically how much light can come into your camera through your lens and how much is hitting the sensor through your lens. So with a smaller hole, you'll get a larger number. So like that means that is less light coming through to hit the sensor. So this is like f16, f22, things like that. But with a wider hole through the lens, you'll get like f2.8, which means more light is hitting the sensor. So you get more information, which brightens and darkens your videos and your photos based on f-stop. Everything that I've said pretty much affects the brightness of what's coming through the camera. So shutter speed affects it, ISO affects it, and aperture affects the brightness of what you see in your viewfinder or the product that you put out. So aperture is basically like the eye of the camera, and it allows light to hit the sensor depending on what f-stop you're at, which is also found in manual mode. Understanding now what we understand about camera basics, manual mode, aperture, ISO, shutter speed, all of that jazz, just getting you started into the world of cinematics. That's all I wanted to do, is just get you started. And now that you're in there, in the next video or some videos to come, we can talk about other things that make up cinematic photos and videos, such as your color grading, your framing. Those things are very important as well. Your composition, all of that jazz is nice. Your lighting, it all plays a part. So I really appreciate you and thank you for watching. If you want me to break down ISO, aperture, and shutter speed even deeper, just leave a comment, let me know, and I'll get on it just for you. Just for you. I'm talking about you. Okay? I'm talking about you.